the major challenges that would be prompted by universities discarding the liberal arts for more technical and utilitarian studies and objectives is that it will leave our countries with a generation of graduates who are trained to look at the problems of the world through absolute and non-negotiable principles. This works, this doesn't work. This switch turns off, this switch turns on. There's only one way of doing things and no other, which is essentially what engineering teaches. The danger of this kind of thinking was borne out a couple of decades ago, when an Oxford study in 2006 or 7 claimed that of all those associated with terrorist incidents up to that time, between 1990 and 2005, 96% were engineers. So though no one was saying that most engineers are terrorists, they did draw the conclusion that most terrorists were engineers. Now, I don't know if that study has held up particularly well in the multiple terrorist incidents that have occurred since it was conducted. But the lesson is clear. A mind rigidly trained in either or binaries and unexposed to the humanities is more susceptible to believing in fundamentals, and that includes political and religious fundamentalism. It is a short step from studying the predictable laws of engineering to following an ideology or a creed that also seems to the engineering-trained mind to be infused with immutable laws. If our graduates were rooted in the idea that there's only one way to think and work, they are likely to apply their habit of mind and thought to their understanding of human beings, of religion, of politics, of ideology, where only one worldview is true and right and everyone else is wrong, where only one worldview is patriotic and everything else is anti-national, where only one view will lead you to God and everyone else is damned to the inferno in any case. To my mind, if our universities churned out legions of such graduates, it would certainly have a devastating impact on our communities, particularly in today's turbulent world where I fear that the increasing move towards populism, isolationism, and the economic and cultural backlash against globalization is only getting accelerated, as we've seen since Mr. Trump's oath of office in the White House. In fact, I've suggested we may well see a process of deglobalization, characterized by trade restrictions, the repatriation of production and supply chains, and the hollowing out of international and multilateral institutions. As I have often remarked, the human mind is like a parachute. It functions best when it's open. You don't want to jump off a plane with a closed parachute, and you don't want to enter the world with a closed mind. I don't think we can afford to produce graduates who have closed minds. The traditional utilitarian approach in India has long prioritized rote memorization, compelling students to absorb what is taught to them in their textbooks and by their teachers, and then regurgitate this in examinations. If this method was already outdated when I was a student, it is entirely obsolete for today's aspiring graduates. In a 21st century world marked by division, conflict, and entrenched identities, what we need is not merely a well-filled mind. Any fact can now be retrieved within seconds on your mobile phone or 2 clicks of a mouse on a computer. Rather, what we need, instead of a well-filled mind, is a well-formed mind. We need individuals who can engage with the unfamiliar, facts they've never heard before, new problems they've never encountered, discern patterns, grasp underlying complexities, and develop thoughtful, innovative solutions to the challenges of our time. In other words, we want students who are not taught what to think, but are taught how to think. That how to think is what is going to give them the opportunity to deal with the unfamiliar. There's an Oxford Martin School study quite recently, a few years ago, which projected that by 2030, nearly 30% of the jobs in the world will be in fields that did not exist when the study was conducted. How do you train somebody for a job that doesn't exist? There is no textbook that's been written because the job still hasn't been thought of, but it's being thought of with dizzying speed. And what's interesting is that the challenge for today's universities is to prepare their students to grasp and grapple with the unknown. Because these jobs, I mean, since the Oxford Martin study was done, you've had the advent of artificial intelligence. There's a whole series of jobs coming around that, including jobs to teach artificial intelligence. But no one could have imagined those jobs when that study was conducted. We've seen now the ways in which new skills, new techniques have to be absorbed and directed. Now, the purpose of university education, therefore, is increasingly to help people, help students, to decipher the unfamiliar, to bridge distances, to render the novel comprehensible. This well-formed mind I talked about, enriched by history, by literature, by the study of human behavior, is ultimately better equipped to navigate uncertainty than one confined to the rigid certitudes of technical training. So my submission to this distinguished gathering is that the future of our universities, and indeed of our higher education system, depends on striking a careful balance between the practical demands of utilitarian education and the broader liberal foundations that expand intellectual horizons and cultivate critical inquiry. If we can embrace the new world without discarding Cardinal Newman entirely, we will be able to find that balance. We must be wary in the process of a growing tendency amongst policymakers to make liberal arts and the humanities, quote unquote, more relevant, reducing them to mere tools for producing more efficient white-collar workers, rather than using them to foster deep-rooted thinkers. Equally concerning is the attempt to repurpose those disciplines for ideological ends, turning history into a vehicle for legitimizing a particular kind of past, political science into lessons on chauvinistic nationalism, or English literature into mere global communication skills for call center employees. Such distortions do not expand intellect, but undermine higher education itself, leaving little room for the imaginative, the ruminative, the philosophical, and the theoretical. And this is all the more compounded by today's obsession with social media, which has sadly not only contributed to a reduction in the attention span of the average student and the average adult, but has also deprived young people of the habits of deep, lengthy reading and complex engagement with ideas that are so fundamental, ultimately, to meaningful thought and intellectual inquiry. So this calls for a firm commitment to academic freedom and the clear separation of higher education institutions from external influences that seek to shape them for ulterior purposes. The Hindi scholar Apurvanand, for example, has warned of increasing efforts to impose exclusionary ideologies in academic spaces, which he argues undermine democracy by weakening society's ability to hold those in power accountable. He distinguishes between freedom of expression and academic freedom, emphasizing that while citizens may not always have the means to critically assess those in power, academics, through their professional training, their intellectual expertise, have a responsibility to think freely for the sake of the public. Academic freedom, therefore, is not merely a right, but a fundamental necessity for the advancement of knowledge and the preservation of democratic values. Now, this argument is crucial to understanding the future of universities. In today's globalized world and diverse democracy, students will inevitably encounter others who do not share their beliefs, their cultural practices, their customs. Yet the rejection of liberal cosmopolitanism has led to an increasingly fractured society, where many in leadership view diversity as a problem rather than as a strength. They promote a monolithic vision of the nation, defined by faith, community, and language, and demanding social conformity. I would like the university to be the last bastion of the diversity of all of these practices. And amidst the rise of divisive politics, where entire groups are often stigmatized as the other with a capital O, an alarming lack of empathy has emerged. Too few can recognize that despite differences in religion, race, and language, we share the same dreams, the same fears, the same hopes. Many struggle to broaden their minds to grasp both the vast complexity of human experience and the universality of human aspirations. In producing such graduates, our universities have regrettably failed us. It is vital that our universities are therefore courageous enough to remain as open and free spaces, where dissent and multiple worldviews are welcome and cherished for their complexity and diversity, and which ensures that in our rambunctious, chaotic, and magnificent democracy, spaces and channels are always kept open for all points of view. The future of our universities must be rooted in developing a generation of leaders that is more ready to deal with the national and global order, a world where multiple realities coexist, where alternative worldviews and convictions have to be encouraged and negotiated with, and where students are taught to look beyond themselves and their immediate surroundings to the reality of interdependence and peaceful coexistence. In fact, there's a British educationist who's written about some of this, Robert Anderson, who outlined 3 possible futures for the university model. First, he said it could be expanded across mass higher education through resource-intensive and vocational training. Second, he said you can abandon it in favor of a purely utilitarian managerial approach. And third, universities could embrace diverse missions while ensuring fair access to research-led institutions, a principle threatened by privatization and market-driven fees. And Anderson, for a Brit, points to the American model, where differentiation has preserved the pursuit of knowledge and liberal education more effectively, he argues, than in Europe. What I get from this is that we should probably see the idea of a university not as a fixed list of immutable characteristics, as Newman did, but, in Anderson's words, as, quote, a set of tensions permanently present but resolved differently according to time and place. I like that. These tensions would include those between teaching and research, between autonomy and accountability. I know that Xavier says autonomous in brackets right after its name, that's great. Between intellectual integrity and socio-economic relevance. But they should also feature legitimate debates in our country about benchmarking Indian universities against international scholarly communities, about their role in shaping our national identity, in exploring, defending, and expanding our national culture. The idea of a university must reconcile the tensions between the inevitable connection of public universities with the state and private ones with the most powerful and richest corporations, versus the need to maintain critical distance between reproducing the existing social, economic, and occupational structures against expanding it from below by promoting the marginalized and excluded through affirmative action to ensure social mobility. Between serving the economy versus providing a space free from the immediate utilitarian pressures dictated by the job market. I know these seem to be difficult to reconcile, but we need to do that. Above all, there is a chronic and perhaps permanent tension between universities as places devised to encourage open and critical attitudes against society's expectation that universities will impart useful qualifications and employable skills in the service of India's future. Obviously, we have to resolve that tension too. And a balance has to be struck that seeks the impossible, to reconcile seemingly incompatible objectives with the ethos of commitment to a better future for a better India. We must be far-sighted enough to recognize that at its core, in a democratic society, our universities must evolve into spaces where an ideal version of democracy is itself allowed to thrive. In other words, our universities must become the staging ground for experiments in developing the most principled version of our democratic ethos, and by extension a microcosm of what our democratic society could one day be. A place where you're free to think, and if I can say this in a Jesuit college, where you're free to think heresy and not be punished for it. Of course, I meant political heresy, but you get the point. We cannot, of course, teach and reach these ideals if we do not actively strive to ensure that our campuses are inclusive and representative. After all, no democratic model can sustain itself if it does not carve out spaces for all voices, no matter how big or small, to be heard. This is not just what we try to rectify through instruments like affirmative action, reservations, need-based scholarship programs, which are all very important, but a commitment to really taking stock of the barriers to access and inclusion that permeate all levels of our society. Take, for instance, the issue of online learning that was the norm during the height of the pandemic. We live in a world brought to us by Facebook, Google, and Twitter, but we also live in a world where over 2.6 billion individuals do not have access to the internet, including 1 billion children, for whom it will not be possible to either work remotely or learn remotely. According to UNESCO, globally, only just over half of households, 55%, have an internet connection. In the developed world, 87% are connected, compared to 47% in developing nations, and just 19% in the least developed countries. Now, these harsh realities, compounded by infrastructure gaps, lack of electricity, unreliable Wi-Fi, and teachers unprepared for digital learning or even for guiding digital learning, have created insurmountable barriers for the marginalized, sometimes driving them to despair. There was a tragic incident during the pandemic that has haunted me for a long time, when a class 10 Dalit student in Kerala, a bright topper, she was always first in her class, immense potential. The COVID lockdown happened, classes went online. Her father was a daily wage earner. He suddenly had no wages anymore because there was no daily work available during the lockdown. When many of us drew the attention of the left government in Kerala to the fact that many children could not go online, they said they would broadcast the classes on free-to-air television. But this poor family didn't have a working television. The one they had was broken. They didn't have the money to repair it. This poor girl was cut off from those online classes. With it, she felt she was cut off from her future. She saw all the other students way ahead of her, and she took her own life. It's a terribly painful story, and perhaps there weren't too many such examples, thank God, but it was a terribly painful moment. And I remember one of the things I did immediately after, as soon as we were able to interact with people, was to launch a drive to collect internet-enabled mobile phones for poor children in government schools. And we got quite a few donated from people, for people in my constituency. But this is still the reality for many people in India. We live in Kerala is a much more prosperous state than many. And these are realities that educationists cannot afford to forget while we sit here protected by our privilege and discussing what a university means for all of us. But it doesn't have to be this way. Online education and e-learning has its limitations. It overlooks the great value of campus interactions for students across social classes, across regional divides, religious divides, caste divides, and the comradeship that arises from shared experience and shared learning. I have no doubt that it was a blessing when the lockdown ended and colleges and campuses could come back to life. If our universities can be places where we can come together and develop these free spaces where the social barriers of class and caste are left behind, and where instead young Indians are given the tools to lead an empowered life, A space where narrow-minded and exclusionary identities are replaced by willingness to accept differences and cherish the diversity not just of identity but of thought and belief. A space that is confident enough to look at its wealth of differences as a strength and not so insecure as to look at it as a weakness that must be rooted out. A space where the administration is attuned to the aspirations of the students, the next generation of India's leaders, and where those young minds, the engines of our democratic and pluralist society, are not subsumed only by personal ambition or the commercial rat race, but are invested in not just improving their minds, but in the successes of those around them. If we manage to do all of this, we can develop an idea of the university that remains open, inclusive, and representative, and yet anchored in the realities of India. An idea that will become the engine of tomorrow's India. If we can manage to do this, I am confident that the India of tomorrow will be carried forward by a generation of leaders that will have been empowered by their university life to take our country to new heights. I believe it can be done, and I'm confident that you, the bearers of the legacy of Father Herbert de Souza, are the ones who can help us to do it. Thank you very much for your patient listening. Jai Hind.